I'll give it that, but oops. It's actually me! My name is Charlie Spearman. I'm a park ranger here, and this program is about Grant from his birth to Shiloh. So we're not going to go into his presidency, but let's move on here to an actual, if we can get off of me. Yeah, there we go. Here he is, Hiram Ulysses Grant, born April the 27th, 1822, and that's the youngest picture I could find of Grant, with his boyhood friend Harry Wilson, born at Point Pleasant, Ohio. And we're going to go forward from April 22 to April 62. So, there's his birthplace in Point Pleasant. It is still there. If you visit it today, that's what you'll see, depending on the time of year. And his parents, looking kind of grumpy there, Jesse Ruth Grant, and his mother, Hannah Simpson Grant, a very quiet woman who never went to the White House when he was there. And the doctor who delivered him came on horseback. He had 2 deliveries that night. He woke up, saddled his horse, went to each home, and successfully delivered each baby. Ulysses was a small boy, but everything went normally. 2 young women from the area nursed him, and when he was a baby, this is Abby Clark and Minty O'Banion, a former slave, who had been a housekeeper to Senator Thomas Morris, later worked for the Lyman Beecher family. Now, Jesse Grant, the father, the family's originally from Connecticut, and they were following what's called the Connecticut Western Reserve, because Connecticut claimed land in Pennsylvania and what's today Ohio. And the Grant family had moved to Pennsylvania, and Jesse's born there in 1794 near Greensburg, Westmoreland County. The town is described as situated on a pretty little town, situated on a high hill. And he had already 2 siblings, a 15-year-old half-brother named Peter Grant and a 2-year-old sister, Susan. Next year, Sister Margaret was born, and 2 years after that, Noah. The Grants were originally from Connecticut, and Westmoreland County was claimed by Connecticut until Pennsylvania decided that that wasn't proper, and it became part of Pennsylvania. They moved on to Ohio eventually. His father was a struggling farmer and part-time convict, so his father was not terribly successful. They moved in 1799 when Jesse was 5, moved to newly established town of Fawcettstown, Ohio, later called East Liverpool, where there was a group of 6 log cabins established by Thomas Fawcett. Here his brother, John Kelly, was born. Around 1804, they moved again to Youngstown, which had just been created in the Western Reserve by John Young, and then the next year they moved to Deerfield, Ohio, where Jesse's mother died in a cabin when he was only 10. So at the age of 10, he's left without a parent, without one of his parents, and his father basically just falls apart at this point. The family is broken up. 2 youngest children go with the father to Maysville, Kentucky, where his half-brother Peter lived and had a tannery. The 3 middle children were sent out to other families. Jesse, who's 11, and his older sister Susan are left to fend for themselves. So now Jesse goes to live with George Todd for a while in Youngstown, and he'll live there for a while. Todd is an important Ohio politician. His son David, who was a small boy at the time, would eventually become the Civil War governor of Ohio. And then between 18 and 12, Jesse would live with Owen Brown and his family. That's Todd on the left, Owen Brown on the right. And that was in Deerfield. That's where he starts learning the tanning business at the Brown Tannery. Now, why are the Browns significant? Mainly because of the sun. While learning the tanning trade, Jesse meets Owen's young son John there on the right, and that's the Owen Brown house, which still stands. He'd been born in 1800, and he said later on to his son, I have often heard my father speak of John Brown, particularly since the events of Harper's Ferry. Brown was a boy when they lived in the same house, but he knew him afterwards and regarded him as a man of great purity of character, high moral and physical courage, but a fanatic and an extremist in whatever he advocated. So both of these gentlemen will have famous sons. Now, after an apprenticeship with his half-brother Peter in the tannery at Maysville, Jesse will move to Ravenna, Ohio, where he becomes partners in the tannery with John F. Wells. At this point, Jesse's 23. Unfortunately, he'll become ill. He's unable to work. He's got malaria, and he will lose his savings. He's forced to move back to Maysville until he recovers. By 1821, he's finally recovered and has become a foreman of a tannery owned by Thomas Page in Point Pleasant, Ohio, and that's the tannery. And it was through Thomas Page that he meets Hannah Simpson. In 1821, he'll marry Hannah. 1822, their first child, Hiram Ulysses, was born. And they're pretty prosperous there, because by October 1823, Jesse saved $1,100. He's able to start his own tannery. And they moved to Georgetown, Ohio. Georgetown, Jesse's fairly successful. His family and wealth increase. He works as a tanner, butcher, hauler, builder, and he owns a carriage service, 2 small farms. At one point, he's mayor of the town. Eventually, he will also own tanneries in Portsmouth, Kentucky. He'll have a leather store in Galena, Illinois, and branch stores across Wisconsin and near Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So he's fairly successful as a tanner, and that shows the Grant house there across the road, and the tannery in the foreground. And there's the house, Grant's boyhood home there in Georgetown. So that's where Grant grows up. And you can see it's right on the edge of the town there. So it's almost in town. It's not really out in the country or anything. And he goes to school there in Georgetown. It's a subscription school. Jesse's father makes sure he has a good education. And his first teacher is John D. White. He starts when he's 6 years old. And White's sons, Carr B. White and Chilton White, will go to school there and will be 2 of Ulysses, as he calls himself, early friends. So Ulysses has grown up and he's going to school. His first year of school is within sight of the Grant residence. Grant house and tannery are at the bottom of the hill. It's a small town. Now, I don't know about you, how many of you would want to live right next to a tannery? Okay, this is the tanning process. When an animal skin is tanned, first you have to kill the animal, which isn't much fun, and skin it. You prepare the hides by curing them with salt. Curing is employed to prevent putrefaction during the time lag that might occur from procuring the hide to when it is processed. The process known as soaking, the hides are soaked in clean water to remove salt left over from curing. After soaking, the hides and skins are taken for liming treatment. The objectives of this operation are mainly to remove the hairs and prepare the hide to condition for tannage. Tanning occurs naturally in the bark and leaves of many plants, including chestnuts and oaks. Tannins will bind to the hide and the coat, causing them to become less water soluble and more flexible, and then the whole thing's kind of a real smelly process. And it's how his father made his living, but Grant never liked it. He, of course, living across from it would have been pretty stinky. He says, I detested the trade, preferring almost any other labor. But I was fond of agriculture and all employment in which horses were used. He preferred to haul the wood used in the tannery instead of actually working in the tannery itself. By the time he was 8, he was driving a team of horses out to the choppers to pick up wood. By 10, he was driving a wagon team by himself to Cincinnati to deliver shipments of leather. He seemed to have a natural ability with horses and enjoyed anything dealing with horses. Grant really likes horses. Now, as most young boys will do, he played around, went fishing at the age of 7. He almost drowns in White Creek near his home in Georgetown. His friend and fishing partner, 9-year-old Daniel Ammon, manages to reach down and pull him to safety, and that's White Oak Creek. And Dan's older brother, by the way, Jacob, would graduate from West Point in 1831 and become a mathematics instructor there. He'll also command a brigade here in the Battle of Shiloh on the second day. Jacob Ammon, who becomes a general. Daniel himself would become a captain in the U.S. Navy during the Civil War and conclude his career as a rear admiral. So these children go on to become famous. One who did not become quite so famous, well, we'll get to him later. Next book page. But Grant's schooling continues. He goes to school in Maysville, Kentucky at this academy, the Richardson and Rand School. And then he'll go to school at the Presbyterian Academy in Ripley, Ohio in 1837. And he doesn't care much about school. He's an indifferent student. Grant says, I was not studious in habit and probably did not make progress enough to compensate for the outlay for board and tuition. At all events, both winters were spent in going over the same old arithmetic, which I knew every word of before, and repeating a noun is a noun of a thing, is the name of a thing, which I had also heard my Georgetown teachers repeat until I come to believe it. So he's not real excited about school, not a scholarly type. Grant would get an unexpected opportunity when the richest young man from Georgetown, George Bartlett Jr., the son of the doctor, who had received an appointment to West Point in 1837, has problems. He doesn't have passing grades. He goes to a prep school to try to improve his education. The following year he tries to re-enter West Point, but he can't make good enough grades to stay in, and he's dismissed in 1838. This opens up a spot at West Point for an appointment. Now Bailey here, although he didn't make it through West Point, would join the Army during the Civil War and would serve as a major in a Western Virginia unit, and he would be killed early on in November 1861 in fighting in what's now West Virginia. Grant's father told him, Ulysses, I believe you're going to receive the appointment. Grant didn't know anything about it. He says, what appointment? To West Point. I've applied for it, but I won't go, he says. He said he thought I would, and I thought so too if he did. I really had no objection to going to West Point, except that I had a very exalted idea of the requirements necessary to go through. I did not believe I possessed them and could not bear the idea of failing as his neighbor had done. So he's really worried that he's not going to be able to make it because obviously this other boy from Georgetown had flunked out. Thomas Hamer, the local congressman there on the left, would make the appointment, and he's in a rush, filling in the paperwork. He can't remember Grant's first name because everybody calls him Ulysses, so he puts down Ulysses and then Simpson, his mother's maiden name, by mistake. So Grant's name will be changed forever. No longer will he be Hiram Ulysses Grant. He will become Ulysses Simpson Grant. Hamer would later die in the Mexican War. Lieutenant Grant, who admired him at that time, said that the United States had lost a future president. Apparently he thought very well of Hamer. Oh, Hamer was a Democrat and had problems at times with Grant's father, who was a Whig. Grant liked to travel, was eager to get away from Georgetown, although not particularly interested in West Point. He leaves home. He's a boy of 17. He's only 5'1", and he weighs 117 pounds. So he's not a big guy. He has sandy brown hair and freckles with small hands and feet, and he enjoys his traveling. He travels by steamboat to Philadelphia, then by canal boat over the mountains by the Allegheny Portage, which is what you see here, where they haul the barges over the mountain. That's now a National Historic Site, part of the Park Service. So you can visit that area and see where the Allegheny Portage was. And then he got on a train, his first train ride from Harrisburg to Philadelphia at the maximum speed of 18 miles per hour. It's pretty exciting stuff. Stayed for a few days with his Simpson relatives in Philadelphia and stopped for several days in New York City. Kind of delaying because he dreaded his arrival at West Point because he didn't think he was going to be good enough and he was afraid he'd have to be sent home. He arrives at West Point, checks into Rose Hotel, and he goes to register. He's surprised to find there's two Grants. Elihu from New York and U.S. from Ohio. So he finds out, gee, my name's been changed. About 2 weeks later, he will pass the examination for admission without difficulty, very much to his surprise. So Grant's doing better than he had expected. Since he's kind of a small guy, he kind of stays out of the way, he's inconspicuous, he doesn't have that much hazing to endure. His only complaint is that the classes are wearisome, uninteresting, they're boring. James Longstreet, who's a big guy, describes Grant as fragile. Says he avoided most sports, but that he was the most daring horseman in the academy. And he didn't like horses. At the graduation exercises in the riding hall, Grant was singled out to give a riding demonstration on a particularly difficult horse, which they considered getting rid of, named York. Sergeant Hirschberger, the Prussian riding instructor, lifted the jumping bar higher than his head and barked, "Cadet Grant!" Grant dashed from the ranks on York and galloped to the end of the riding hall. He turned the horse and rode faster and faster, then up over the bar. Hirschberger growled, "Very well done, sir." And that record would stand for 25 years. So he was a good rider. Now, while Grant was at West Point, he had no problems with his studies. He did middling work, did well in math and geology. His core subject was French. By the second year, he ranked 10th out of 53, although he wouldn't end up that high. He had little interest in the program. He said, a military life had no charms for me. I had not the faintest idea of staying in the Army, even if I should be graduated, which I did not expect. So he doesn't want to go in the military. He isn't interested in this. And when there were some reports that Congress would shut down the school, he hoped it would happen and give him an honorable way to escape and get home. He spent much of his time reading popular romantic novels from the library and never read his lessons more than once. Finally graduated in 1843, ranking 21st in a class of 39. A number of his demerits were due to his refusal to go to the church, the chapel there. He simply thought it was compulsory attendance was not appropriate, and he viewed it as anti-Republican. One thing Grant did enjoy at West Point, though, was art. One course he enjoyed, taught by Robert Walter Weir, an accomplished artist from the Hudson River School. Grant painted classical European landscapes, Indians, and animals. As you can see, there's some Grant's paintings. So he might have become a painter had he not gone into the Army. But 10 years later, Weir would teach another cadet who would fail in chemistry, and his name was James McNeill Whistler. You might have heard of him. He becomes a famous painter. Later on, Whistler said that if silicon had been a gas, I would have been a major general. So apparently his problems with chemistry lead him to leave the academy and become a painter instead. Grant wanted an assignment with the cavalry, but he's too shy to really push hard for it. He gets assigned to the 4th Infantry as a second lieutenant, intends to resign as soon as his obligation is up. He had gained height at West Point. He is now 5'7", 5'8", around that, but his weight's back down to 117. So he still doesn't weigh very much. He has a respiratory ailment. He's afraid he might have tuberculosis. One of his brothers had died of tuberculosis, but he would eventually recover. Now, eventually, later on in life, Grant would put on a bit of weight. Later on, when he and Julia, his wife, went on a tour of Europe, they would stop and get weighed at a exhibition in London, and Grant was up to 165. Julia weighed in at 175. Now, Grant had made a friend at West Point. His last roommate was Frederick Dent, with whom he was assigned to duty with the 4th Infantry at Jefferson Barracks, there on the left, which is still there in St. Louis, under the command of Colonel Stephen Kearney. Now, Dent was from that area. As a matter of fact, Dent's home, Whitehaven, was 12 miles to the south across Gravois Creek. The Dent family had settled there about 1820 with land made for business in Pittsburgh and St. Louis. The father, Colonel Dent, had 30 slaves. Bridget took Grant to his home to visit, where he met his sister Julia, who's up there on the right. And Julia was no beauty, but she had been something of a tomboy, enjoying fishing, riding, and hunting. She and Ulysses enjoyed each other's company, and they spent time riding together. Later on, Julia would sort of exaggerate Whitehaven a little bit, make it sound like something from Terror and Gone with the Wind, but they did form an acquaintance. Now, after leaving Jefferson Barracks to visit his family in Bethel, Ohio, Grant will return to find that the regiment has been sent down to Louisiana. He sets out to visit Julia at Whitehaven, finds his way blocked by the rain-swollen Gravois Creek, which is flowing higher than his horse's head. So if you're Grant, what are you going to do? You going to turn around? No. Not Grant. Grant does not turn around. He always gets to his objective one way or the other throughout his life. If he starts something, he will not turn back. In this case, he swims his horse across the creek to get to Whitehaven. Up to that point, Julia had been reluctant to agree to wear his class ring, but now she agrees, and they will eventually become engaged, although it will be 4 more years before they would be married. And the reason for this is because war is brewing. Grant reports for duty to Lieutenant Richard Ewell, commanding Jefferson Barracks, at the end of his leave, and he's ordered to join his regiment in Louisiana, part of the Army of Observation, commanded by General Zachary Taylor. Grant had hoped to avoid continuing service in the Army. As a matter of fact, he had applied to West Point to get a professorship, or to become an assistant there. And he applied to Professor Church. He was hoping eventually to get a professorship in some college teaching mathematics. But the war will make a difference. His plans are upset because the annexation of Texas will bring on the Mexican War. Now, Grant's unit stationed near Natchitoches, forgive me if I don't pronounce that right, Louisiana, on high ground back from the Red River. The place was given the name of Camp Salubrity, and it proved to be. It had springs which furnished an abundance of cool, pure water. The ridge was above the flight of mosquitoes, which abound in that region in great multitudes and great voracity. The regiment occupied the camp for 6 months before the first death occurred, which was an accident. And there's Grant at Camp Salubrity with his friend Alexander Hayes, and Grant on the left there has his horse, racing horse Dandy, and Hayes is there with Sunshine. So now, many of the officers didn't care whether the annexation or whether the war started up, but Grant was very much opposed to the whole thing. He says, "I bitterly oppose the measure. To this day, regard the war which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation." He was not in favor of the Mexican War. Now, Grant kept a horse, rode, stayed out of doors most of the time by day, and entirely recovered from his cough. He thinks that perhaps that saved his life. His health was restored by this exercise and exposure, and so he was saved by the Army, which he didn't approve of. But nevertheless, in 1845, the regiment will be moved to Jackson's Barracks, New Orleans, where a yellow fever epidemic is raging in the city. September, they'll be transferred by boat to Corpus Christi, Texas, seen there on the right. Not very impressive, a small Mexican hamlet containing less than 100 people and a few Americans. They're at a trading post, mainly selling tobacco to Mexican smugglers. So back then, there was a smuggling went that way instead of the other. And they established a camp there. And there's the camp of what was now called the Army of Occupation. Grant would be appointed quartermaster for the 4th Infantry and promoted from brevet 2nd Lieutenant to full 2nd Lieutenant. He's sent on a trip to Austin, Texas. On the way, his party stops to engage in hunting. And Grant finds himself confronted by a flock of wild turkeys. Finds that he does not care for shooting animals. In March, the Army reaches the Rio Grande and marches inland, establishing a fort on the river, which came under attack by the Mexicans when the Army marches back toward the coast. As the noise of fire was heard, Grant expressed concern. But for myself, a young second lieutenant who had never heard a hostile gun before, I felt sorry that I had enlisted. So he's not that eager to get into war. But as the war starts up, the quartermaster, who could have stayed back out of action, can't restrain himself. In the Battle of Palo Alto, he will come forward, and it's the 8th of May. He approaches the army, which is the Mexicans outnumber them. The Mexicans are drawn up in line of battle. One cannonball passes through our ranks, not far from me, so he's under combat. He's under fire. It took off the head of an enlisted man and the underjaw of Captain Page of my regiment, while the splinters from the musket of the killed soldier and his brains and bones knocked down 2 or 3 others. So there's the first battle of the war at Palo Alto. The next day there would be another battle as the Americans pursued at Resaca de la Palma. Taylor would halt the army and send out in advance a party, including Captain C.F. Smith of the artillery and Captain McCall of Grant's company. And they'll take 150 picked men and they'll leave Grant in charge of the company, which he considers an honor and responsibility he thinks very great. And he is with the right wing of the army, and they will go forward and encounter the Mexicans. And there will be few men left. Most of the Mexicans will take off, but there'll be a few left, and he will charge them with his company. So he gets a chance to get into combat there. And he feels proud of the army he's a member of. He says, a more efficient army for its members, an army I do not believe ever fought a battle, the one commanded by General Taylor. And soon volunteers start to flow in, and they will move across the river to Matamoros, Mexico. And Grant will call this now the Army of Invasion. Lieutenant Colonel Garland will lead the brigade, and which they're part of. And they'll be marching along the Rio Grande. Grant, as quartermaster, will be put in charge of hiring pack mules with Mexicans to pack and drive them. And he says that there were not men enough in the army to manage the train of mules without the help of Mexicans who had learned how. After the march had started, the tents and cooking utensils had to be made into packages so that they could be lashed to the backs of the mules. It took several hours to get ready to start each morning. By the time we were ready, some of the mules first loaded would be tired of standing so long while they're with loads on their backs. And the mules were apparently contrary. He says, I'm not aware of ever having used a profane adjective in my life, but I would have the charity to excuse those who may have done so if they were in charge of a train of Mexican mules. So during the fighting at Monterey, again, Quartermaster Grant becomes interested in the action. His curiosity gets the better of him. He mounts his horse, goes forward to see what's going on. Is there a short time when an order is made to charge? Lacking the moral courage to return to camp, where I'd been ordered to stay, I charged with the regiment. As soon as the troops were out of a depression, they came under fire from the Black Fort. About 1/3 of the men engaged in the charge were killed or wounded in the space of a few minutes. I believe I was the only person left in the 4th Infantry on horseback. The adjutant of the regiment, very much fatigued from running on foot, seeing me on a horse, expressed a wish that he could be mounted. Also, I offered him my horse. A few minutes later, I saw a soldier, a quartermaster's man, mounted not far away. I ran to him, took his horse, and was back with the regiment in a few minutes. The adjutant to whom I had loaned my horse was killed, and I was designated to act in his place. Now, they're attacking the Black Fort. It's a frontal charge, probably, and Grant considers it a foolish move. You can see the Black Fort is B there, so they're in a difficult position. They're soon low on ammunition. Grant volunteers to ride back to get the message that they need ammunition. And his ride back was a difficult one. Before starting, I adjusted myself to the side of the horse, furthest from the enemy, and with only one foot holding to the cantle of the saddle and an arm over the neck of the horse exposed, I started at full run. It was only at street crossings that my horse was under fire, but these are crossed at such a flying rate that I generally was past and under cover of the next block of houses before the enemy fired. I got out safely without a scratch. So again, Grant proves what a horseman he is. Monterey is captured, and a new general is put in charge of the invasion of Mexico. General Scott will assume command of the Army of Invasion, and Grant will be assigned to a position under Scott. So he serves under both the generals during the Mexican War. His regiments are transferred. The troops will form part of the forces which will operate against Veracruz, which will be captured. And so Grant is accompanying Scott's army. And most of the credit will go to the engineers, people like Beauregard and Lee, rather than to quartermasters. After defeating the Mexicans at Cerro Gordo, they'll continue to advance toward Mexico City. At Molina del Rey, Grant will help capture some Mexican soldiers during the attack on the San Cosme Gate seen here. Grant will take the initiative, manage to get a house or put into the belfry of a church, which disperses the opposing Mexican troops in confusion. General Worth is so impressed that he sends Lieutenant John Pemberton, his aide, to commend Grant for his performance. So Grant is commended. In the spring of 1848, a party of officers decided to climb this mountain, Popocatépetl, the highest volcano in America, and he joins the party, which includes many future Civil War generals, including Simon B. Buckner, who had been at West Point with Grant, so they know each other. And Grant says, my experience in the Mexican War was of a great advantage to me afterwards. Besides the many practical lessons it taught, the war brought nearly all the officers of the regular army together, so as to make them personally acquainted. It also brought them in contact with volunteers, many of whom served in the War of the Rebellion afterwards. Now, the Mexican War is over. Grant finally gets to go back and marry his fiancée, Julia. August 28th, he gets leave and marries Julia. He's a 26-year-old veteran. He could have joined the family business, but he decides to stay in the Army. Wait for an opportunity that appealed to him. He does not want to be working in his family's leather business. After a honeymoon steamboat cruise along the Mississippi and Ohio, Grant is assigned to Madison Barracks, Sackett's Harbor, New York, and they'll live there in either Detroit or Sackett's Harbor, which Grant describes as as dull a little hole as you ever saw. In 1850, their first son, Frederick Dent Grant, is born in St. Louis. 1851, the 4th U.S. is assigned to the West Coast. They decide that Julia, who's pregnant again, should not make the trip because of the dangers of crossing the Isthmus of Panama. So there's Madison Barracks in Sackett's Harbor. And probably a wise decision. This shows the going up the Chagres River, crossing the Isthmus. Grant's second child, Ulysses Grant Jr., will be born in Bethel, Ohio. While he's making the crossing, cholera will break out in the party. Grant will help to get them across by acquiring mules and setting up a hospital, but 150 men from the regiment will die, including his friend from West Point, Lieutenant John Gore. So they have a tough time. They'll reach San Francisco and be assigned to the Benicia Barracks. Grant's impressed with California. In San Francisco, he invests his salary in a store there in partnership with Elijah Camp from Sackett's Harbor. The store will fail. Grant will lose all the money he invested. 1852, Grant would be assigned to an isolated post at Fort Vancouver in Washington Territory. And he'll move into the officers' quarters there. And while there, he'll be promoted to captain. In 1853, he'll be reassigned to Fort Humboldt, California. Now, while there, Grant will try another scheme to make money. He'll start growing potatoes, but the Columbia River floods and washes out his potato crop. So he's not having much luck in anything. Grant finds Fort Humboldt a lonely post in Northern California. He despises the commander. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Buchanan complains that he has nothing to do but sit in his room and read or ride horses. He misses his wife and children. He becomes very depressed. There are rumors that he begins to drink heavily. He writes Julia. He says, I sometimes get so anxious to see you and our little boys that I'm almost tempted to resign and trust to Providence on my own exertions, for a living where I can have you and them with me. So he misses his family, and he will finally leave. He resigns his commission, April 11th, 1854, travels back by way of Nicaragua to New York City, where he arrives on June 17th, checks into the Astor House. Don't check into fancy hotels if you don't have money. He has to end up borrowing money from his old classmate Simon B. Buckner to pay the bill before he gets back to the St. Louis area. October 1854, they're united in her parents' house, Whitehaven. For the rest of his life, Grant will spend as little time as possible away from Julia, so he doesn't want to leave her again. What will he do now? He obtains the use of his brother-in-law's farm called Wish to make a living as a farmer. During this time, Grant also acquires a slave from Julia's father. Julia herself had inherited 4 slaves. 1856, Grant will build this house, which he calls Hardscrabble, and they will try to make a living. Julia turns out to be a pretty good chicken farmer. Grant tries to grow potatoes again, but things just don't work out. He'll try investing in selling firewood in St. Louis. Attempts to make money in real estate. 2 more children are born, Nellie and Jesse Root Jr. But finally, in 1860, he's forced to give up and go to work for his father in the leather shop at Galena, Illinois. He moves into this house in Galena, so at least he's able to bring his family there. When he had first questioned his father about this, he had said, okay, I'll get you a job, but you have to leave your family behind, which Grant would not agree to. But in 1861, the Civil War breaks out. Mass meetings held in Galena. Grant is recognized as the only military professional in the area. They ask him to lead the meeting. He recruits a company of volunteers, which he will accompany to Springfield, but he doesn't want to be in charge of them. He lets Augustus Chetlain take over the company. Eventually, he will be leading. Chetlain will lead the 12th Illinois in this battle as colonel. He accepts promotion to recruit and train volunteer units, but he expects to get a field command in the regular army based on his experience in the army. And in spite of efforts, even a letter to General McClellan, he has no success. So he's not having any success getting the position he thinks he deserved. He continues working with volunteer recruits, serves as a mustering officer, becomes discouraged because you have to pull so many political strings to get a commission. And so he goes home. So it appears that the 39-year-old Grant, a financial failure, will be left at home and forgotten in the coming conflict. So when he's about to be rescued from Oblivion, things will change rapidly. A new unit has been organized, the 21st Illinois at Mattoon, Illinois, is under the temporary command of Simon S. Good, an inebriate with little military experience except on a filibustering expedition to Central America. Simon Good is an interesting character. He carries 3 revolvers and a Bowie knife with him at all times. Tries to convince the men that he never sleeps, but he is unable to enforce discipline. He is quoting Napoleon from time to time and drinks with the men. And the unit has a bad reputation. They'll break out of the camp to get drunk. They'll burn the guardhouse, and they'll stage a bread riot. Governor Yates, in desperation, calls Grant to enforce order in this unruly regiment. He borrows some money to acquire a horse and accoutrements, and he finds it very hard work for a few days to bring all the men into anything like subordination. But the great majority favored discipline, and by the application of a little regular army punishment, all were reduced to good discipline, as one could ask. I remained in Springfield with my regiment till the 3rd of July, when I was ordered to Quincy, Illinois. By that time, the regiment was in a good state of discipline, and the officers and men were well up in the company drill. And there's the 21st band, which Grant did not like to listen to. He would go a mile out of his way to avoid listening to the band. He did not like music. And he will leave Galena. He's overtaken by a dispatch saying that the destination of the regiment had been changed to Ironton, Missouri, and he's ordered to halt and wait the arrival of a steamer, which had been dispatched up the Illinois River to take the regiment to St. Louis. And he will bring his son with him, his oldest son, Frederick D. Grant, and there's the Grant family. His son is 11 years old. And as they approach the field of battle, he's a little nervous because he's been in all the engagements in Mexico, but he wasn't in command. He says it would be all right if he was lieutenant colonel, but as colonel, he feels some trepidation. He's responsible now. Before we were prepared to cross the Missouri River at Quincy, my anxiety was relieved, for the men of the besieged regiment came struggling into town. I'm inclined to think both sides got fractured and ran away from each other. So he starts to train his troops, but he's never looked at a copy of tactics from the time of his graduation. He's unfamiliar with the new drill, and there was a good opportunity of exercising in the battalion drill. I was at West Point. The tactics used in the Army had been Scots. The musket was the flintlock. I had never looked at a copy of tactics since then. My standing in that branch of studies had been near the foot of the class. In the Mexican War in the summer of 1846, I had been appointed regimental quartermaster and had not been in a battalion drill since. The arms had been changed since then, and Hardy's tactics had been adopted. I got a copy of the tactics and studied one lesson intending to confine the exercise of the first day to the command. So he's trying to learn it. But after looking at it a while, he decides that Hardy's tactics is a mere translation from the French, with Hardy's name attached to it. It was nothing more than common sense. And so he manages to train his troops. He finds no trouble giving commands that would take my regiment where he wants them to go. He says, I do not believe that the officers of the regiment ever discovered that I had never studied the tactics that I used. So he's not familiar with the tactics, but he progresses nevertheless. And he ends up in Mexico, Missouri, many weeks. He hasn't been there many weeks. When he reads the St. Louis paper, finds that the president has asked the Illinois delegation to recommend some citizens for the position of brigadier general, and that he had been selected. So he finds out from the newspapers. Later on in Ironton, Missouri, he will receive his commission as a brigadier general. Ironton he finds to be a very nice place, surrounded by hills, almost mountains. So he will be there. And about this time, he'll run into another gentleman, General Prentice. Now, General Hardy, according to Grant, the author of the tactics I did not study, was in Greenville, 26 miles further south. 10 days after leaving Ironton, I was prepared to take the offensive against the enemy. So when the evening train came in, it brought General Prentice with orders to take command of the district. Now, Grant wasn't too happy about this. He says his orders did not relieve me, but I knew that by law I was senior and was at that time even the president did not have the authority to assign a junior to command a senior of the same grade. I therefore gave General Prentice the situation of the troops, the general condition of affairs, and started to St. Louis. The movement against the rebels never took place. So he and Prentice have not hit it off, and they will clash later as well. He's ordered to Jefferson City. And his campaigns had not yet begun when coming into his office is this gentleman, Colonel Jefferson C. Davis, who he's never seen before, but he introduces himself by handing his orders, which are to relieve me of my command. The orders direct him to St. Louis without delay to receive important special instructions. So Grant can't seem to get anywhere. Every time he goes somewhere, somebody shows up to relieve him. Now, he is assigned to Cape Girardeau, and General Prentice is approaching that place. I went out to meet him, and he runs into Prentice with a large escort, and the Prentice claims to be his superior, and but he does not agree, and so they have some problems again. And Prentice will obey his orders, but will leave to go to St. Louis. And so the expedition he had planned will not happen. So again, he has clashed with Prentice. He'll return to his headquarters, which are now at Cairo, Illinois. And his uniform still hasn't come in. And this is a picture of him there, I believe in the center on the left, along with General McClernand. Neither one's uniforms have arrived yet. The day after I assumed command at Cairo, a man came to me who said he was a scout for General Fremont, reported that he had just come from Columbus, where the Confederates were, and that their troops were starting toward Paducah at the mouth of the Tennessee. There was no time to delay. We started before midnight and arrived early the following morning. They entered the town and the citizens were taken by surprise. They were expecting rebel troops. In fact, nearly 4,000 men from Columbus were on their way. Grant had but 2 regiments and 1 battery, but the Confederates did not know this and turned back to Columbus. So he's been active, and really his uniform arrived. So there's a picture of Grant in his uniform. This is the only picture you ever see of Grant with a sword. And so they're just drilling, not much going on, and he has asked several times to be allowed to make a movement against Columbus, and he finally decides to make a movement against a Confederate camp across from Columbus in a place called Belmont. And when they start out, his men are so excited that they're finally going to see some action that he decides, well, we can't turn back, we've got to go ahead now. So they will land and they will attack the Confederate camp. At first they have success, overrunning the Confederate camp, pushing the Confederates back. The Confederates are taking shelter on the banks of the Mississippi. But his men, Grant's men, stop to start looting the camp. The probable Confederates will have a Shiloh. The Confederates get a chance to recover. Men will start coming across the river to cut them off from their landing place. So, although they've had some success at first, things are not going so well once they capture the camp. And they start to go back toward the boats. A party is left behind, a rear guard. Grant goes back to find the rear guard, only to find that the rear guards gotten past him and they've retreated all the way to the boats. So Grant's the only person left behind. And so his officers have said, we're surrounded, we need to surrender. Grant's response to that is, we fought our way here, we can fight our way out. So Grant's not ready to give up, and when he is abandoned basically by his men, he runs into the Confederates and comes back toward the boat. All the men are on the boats. Grant's the only one left behind. The boats are getting ready to take off, and he will ride his horse down to the bank, and his horse will put his forefeet over the bank without hesitation and without urging, and with his hind feet well under him, slide down the bank. He trots aboard the boat, 12 or 15 feet away, over a single gangplank. I dismounted and went at once to the upper deck. So his horse and Grant managed to get back on the boats. The last man to get away from Belmont. Now, for this battle, he will be be severely criticized. The battle is seen as unnecessary, but he feels like it was, that it saved Colonel Oglesby's detachment. And the 9th of November, 2 days later after the battle, he gets a new commander. Major General H.W. Halleck replaces Fremont and will be in charge in the West. And about this time, Grant gets the idea perhaps they should strike out down the Tennessee River. And he will go to visit Halleck, because General Smith has reported that it looks favorable, and Halleck, he doesn't know very well. And Halleck's not particularly friendly, and when he says what his objective is, Halleck says that that's impossible, preposterous, and so he's cut short. And he goes back to Cairo somewhat crestfallen, because his new commander doesn't seem to be paying any attention to him. But the naval commander, Flag Officer Foote, who has completed gunboats, also under General Halleck, also feels the same way. When Foote writes him, Halleck changes his mind apparently, and on the 1st of February, 1862, he'll be given instructions to move upon Fort Henry, which will be successful. Fort Henry will be captured by the Navy. Grant will put his men ashore, and things seem to be going well. They will march across, they capture what's left of the garrison there. Most of the men have gone over to Fort Donelson. General Tillman will be captured. And so they will make their way to Fort Donelson. Now, Fort Donelson is a little bit tougher than Fort Henry. The fort is about 100 acres of land on the east. It runs the Cumberland River to the north. It faces Hickman Creek, a small stream which is deep and wide because of the backwater from the river. On the south is another small stream, or rather ravine, opening into the Cumberland, filled with high water as well. The fort stands on high ground, some of it as much as 100 feet above the Cumberland. Strong protection for the heavy guns and water batteries. And so it's a pretty formidable fort. He had started from Fort Henry with 15,000 men, and they take up positions to surround, with General Smith on the left, General McClellan on the right, and at the same time the naval boats will be ready to attack, but they won't have much success. At first the enemy is demoralized, but once they turn back the gunboats, they are jubilant. Flag Officer Foote wants to see him. He has been wounded in the attack. So on the morning of the 15th, he will go off to visit. And he doesn't expect anything to happen because the conditions for battle are now more favorable since more Union troops have come in. But while he is on board the ship, the Confederates will try to break out. So Grant will be there at Fort Donelson, and McClernand's forces are hit hard. They will fight gallantly until they're out of ammunition, and although there's an abundance of ammunition nearby lying on the ground, at this stage of the war it was not all of our commanders of regiments, brigades, or even divisions who had been educated up to the point of saying that their men were constantly supplied with ammunition during an engagement. When the men found themselves without ammunition, they could not stand up against troops who seemed to have plenty of it. The division broke and a portion fled, but most of the men, as they were not pursued, only fell back out of range of the fire of the enemy. The enemy fell back within his entrenchments and was there when I got on field. So Grant arrives, and the Confederates will retreat back into their fortifications. No officers seem to be giving any directions. The soldiers had their muskets but no ammunition. So they will be rallied. Colonel Webster will tell them to fill their cartridge boxes quick, get into line. The enemy is trying to escape. They must not be permitted to do so. So they will manage to close the gap that the Confederates have opened up. The Confederates will retreat back to their fortifications. They're now surrounded. The Confederates have to decide what to do. They decide that they'll have to surrender, but General Floyd decides, not me. I was Secretary of War, they might punish me. General Pillow decides, not me. So the third in command, General Simon B. Buckner, will be left in charge. Now, this is Grant's old friend, who asked for terms. Grant says he will only accept unconditional surrender. Buckner's not too happy. He has done things for Grant before. This does not seem very charitable, and he will complain that the brilliant success of Confederate arms yesterday should give them more than this ungenerous and unchivalrous terms. And the surrender negotiations will take place there at the Dover House, the hotel, or inn near Fort Donelson. And they've been at West Point, he'd been at West Point 3 years with Buckner, served him with the Army, so they knew each other. And Grant tries to make up a little bit. He says in the conversation, which was friendly, that if it had been Buckner in command, he would not have gotten Donelson so easily. And told him that he had been in command, I should not have tried it the way I did. Now, about this time, Grant will begin to. Have any of y'all ever gotten in trouble for something you didn't do wrong? Has that ever happened to any of y'all? One or two of you, maybe? Well, about this time, Grant gets in trouble with Alec. Now, from the time of leaving Cairo, he says, I was unfortunate not receiving any dispatches from Halleck. I received nothing direct, which indicated that the department commander knew we were in the possession of Fort Donelson. I was reporting regularly to the chief of staff, who had been sent to Cairo soon after the troops left there, to receive all reports from the front and to telegraph the substance to St. Louis. Cairo was at the southern end of the telegraph line. My dispatches were all sent to Cairo by boat, but many of those addressed to me were sent to the operator at the end of the advancing wire, and he failed to forward them. So Grant's not getting any messages, and apparently Halleck's not getting very many messages from Grant. This operator afterwards proved to be a rebel. He deserted his post after a short time and went south, taking his dispatches with him. On March the 2nd, I received orders dated March the 1st to move my command back to Fort Henry, leaving only a small garrison at Donelson. After his big, and he will also go to Nashville. He informs the department commander of their success, and he's considering going to Nashville. He finally does to consult. Having heard nothing, he had asked permission, but he gets no information. That shows the Union Army of General Buell getting into Nashville. And about this time, Halleck has become somewhat unhappy. He has written on March the 3rd to McClellan, I've had no communication with General Grant for more than a week. He left his command without my authority and went to Nashville. His army seems to be as much demoralized by its victory at Fort Donelson as that of the Potomac was by this defeat at Bull Run. It is hard to censure a successful general immediately after victory, but I think he richly deserves it. I can get no returns, no reports, no information of any kind from him. Satisfied with his victories, he sits down and enjoys it without any regard to the future. I am worn out and tired of this neglect and inefficiency. C.F. Smith is almost the only officer equal to the emergency. March the 4th, Grant will receive a dispatch from General Halleck. You will place Major General Smith in command of the expedition and remain yourself at Fort Henry. Why do you not obey my orders to report strengthened positions of your command? So Halleck and Grant are having problems. Grant is surprised. This is his first he knew of it. He didn't know Halleck had called for this information. On the 6th, he's written again. By Halleck, you're going to Nashville without my authority, and when your presence with your troops was the utmost importance was a matter of very serious complaint in Washington, so much so that I was advised to arrest you on your return. There's General Smith, who will take over for a while. Now, Grant will be restored to command on the 13th, And on the 17th, Halleck would send him a copy of an order from the War Department which stated that the council might misbehave this behavior had reached Washington and directed him to investigate and report the facts. He forwarded also a copy of a detailed dispatch from himself to Washington entirely exonerating me. He did not inform me that it was his own reports that had created all the trouble. On the contrary, he wrote to me, instead of relieving you, I want you, as soon as your new army is in the field, to assume immediate command and lead it to new victories. He also will write to Grant on March the 16th, cautioning him, as the enemy is evidently in strong force, my instructions not to advance so as to bring on an engagement must be strictly obeyed. We must strike no blow until we are strong enough to admit no doubt of the result. And having received this order restoring him to command, Grant will proceed to Savannah on the Tennessee River, to which point my troops had advanced under General Smith, who was delighted to see him. Smith is sick at this point, having scraped his leg, and he's glad to have Grant to take over, and he will not recover from this injury. He will die in the Cherry Mansion. Grant finds the army divided, almost half being on the east bank of the Tennessee at Savannah, while one division was at Crump's Landing on the west bank, the remainder at Pittsburgh Landing 5 miles above Crump's, the enemy at Corinth. At once put all the troops at Savannah in motion for Pittsburgh Landing, knowing that the enemy was fortifying at Corinth and collecting an army there under Johnston. It was my expectation to march against that army as soon as Buell reinforced me with the Army of the Ohio. So that's what Grant's thinking. And reinforcements are arriving daily at Pittsburgh Landing. As you can see here, there are boats piled up, unloading troops and supplies. General Prentice comes in again in order to report to Grant. Probably not too happy about it, but at any rate, Grant's apprehension is much more for the safety of Crump's Landing than Pittsburgh Landing. At this time, I generally spent the day at Pittsburgh and returned to Savannah in the evening. I was intending to remove my headquarters to Pittsburgh, but Buell was expected daily to come into Savannah. I remained at this point, therefore, a few days longer than otherwise I should have done in order to meet him on his arrival. So he's staying in Savannah. Now he does come down to visit on Friday the 4th, and on his way